The camera shutter clicked with the mechanical precision that Samuel Godfrey had perfected over 15 years of traveling from farm to farm, capturing families and livestock for county fair catalogs. November 12, 1887, brought the kind of crisp Vermont morning that made even the most weathered barns look picturesque against the backdrop of dying autumn leaves. Godfrey adjusted his tripod one final time outside the Whitlock property in Ashford County, the heavy glass plate already positioned in his camera box. "Hold steady now," he called to the assembled Whitlock family, though his attention was already wandering to the composition. The barn dominated the frame perfectly. Its weathered siding and sturdy foundation spoke to generations of honest labor. Behind it, a haystack rose in a neat pyramid, exactly the kind of pastoral detail that would sell well in the agricultural section of the fair catalog. Godfrey squeezed the rubber bulb, and the shutter opened and closed in its brief dance with light. The moment was captured. The Whitlock family in their Sunday best, the barn standing proud against the Vermont sky, and, in the background, that haystack with its curious crown of flame and smoke frozen in time. At the moment the photograph was taken, neither Godfrey nor the Whitlocks found anything remarkable about the scene. Farm fires were as common as morning frost in Vermont's agricultural valleys. Hay could smolder for hours, sometimes days, especially when moisture got trapped in the lower layers and fermentation began. The photographer packed his equipment with the same methodical care he brought to every job, accepted his payment of $3, and moved on to the next farm. The glass plate negative found its way to the Vermont Regional Archive along with thousands of other documentary photographs, a visual record of a state transforming from wilderness to civilization. For 43 years, it sat in a filing cabinet marked Agricultural Studies, 1885 to 1890, unremarked and unexamined except for the occasional researcher seeking background material for historical papers. Miss Evelyn Harrow had worked as a cataloger at the Vermont Regional Archive for 7 years when she first encountered the Whitlock photograph in the spring of 1930. A meticulous woman with wire-rimmed spectacles and an eye for detail that had served the archive well, she was conducting a routine review of agricultural photographs when something in the background caught her attention. The flame and smoke rising from the haystack seemed too perfectly formed, too dramatically positioned to be accidental. Intrigued by what appeared to be an unusually artistic composition for a simple farm photograph, Miss Harrow decided to research the Whitlock property further. The Ashford Township Register proved remarkably complete for a rural community. The arrival of the railroad in 1884 had brought not just progress but a newfound dedication to record-keeping that would serve historians well. What she discovered made her hands tremble as she turned the pages of sworn depositions filed with the county clerk. 6 separate witnesses, all respected members of the community, had provided detailed accounts of the same phenomenon. The haystack behind the Whitlock barn, they testified, had been observed burning every evening at dusk from the summer of 1887 through at least the winter of 1927. Thomas Wheeler, who operated the grain elevator closest to the Whitlock property, had sworn before a notary public that he observed the fire blazing bright as day every evening for 3 years running. Never consumed the stack, his deposition read, never spread to the barn. Just burned steady as a church candle, same time every night. Martha Gooding, whose family farm bordered the Whitlock property to the east, provided the most detailed account. Her deposition, filed in 1895, described how she and her husband had grown so accustomed to the site that they used it as a timepiece. "When the Whitlock fire started up, we knew to call the children in for supper," she wrote. "Reliable as clockwork, that fire was." Miss Harrow cross-referenced these accounts with weather records, insurance claims, and fire department logs. Not once in 40 years had anyone reported the haystack fire as a hazard. No investigation had been launched. No attempt at extinguishing had been recorded. The impossible had become routine. The rail line that had brought prosperity to Ashford County in 1884 had also brought sophisticated measuring instruments and educated observers. By 1887, The town boasted not only 2 grain elevators but also a telegraph office, a proper post office, and a Congregationalist parish with meticulous record-keeping. This was not some isolated frontier settlement where tall tales might flourish unchallenged. This was a community with the infrastructure and literacy to document the extraordinary with precision. Dr. Ansel Pruitt served as county coroner for 32 years, a position that required both medical training and an investigative mind. A graduate of Dartmouth Medical College, he had earned respect throughout Ashford County for his thorough approach to unexplained deaths and his careful documentation of unusual events. His official reports were models of scientific methodology and clear prose. But Dr. Pruitt also kept a private ledger, a leather-bound journal discovered in 1931 during the auction of his estate. The entries revealed a man increasingly troubled by phenomena that challenged his medical and scientific training. Between 1887 and 1889, he recorded 17 separate visual anomalies associated with the Whitlock property. His first entry, dated July 15, 1887, described the burning haystack in clinical terms. Flame consistent with hay combustion, approximate temperature 800 to 900 degrees Fahrenheit based on color spectrum. No apparent fuel source renewal. Stack dimensions unchanged after 6 hours of continuous observation. As the months progressed, Dr. Pruitt's entries became more detailed and more disturbed. He documented careful measurements, temperature readings taken with a railroad thermometer, and observations made from multiple vantage points. Each entry confirmed the impossible: a fire that burned without consuming its fuel, that appeared punctually each evening, and that defied every principle of combustion he had learned in medical school. His final entry, dated March 3, 1889, abandoned all pretense of scientific detachment. Written in handwriting that grew increasingly erratic across the page, it read simply, "The barn stands. The fire does not spread. I will not return." Local authorities maintained a silence that spoke volumes. The sheriff's office recorded no complaints about the Whitlock fire. The Volunteer Fire Brigade, established in 1886 with equipment purchased through railroad company donations, never responded to calls about the property. Town council minutes from the period, meticulously preserved in the basement of the Ashford Town Hall, made no mention of the phenomenon that had captivated and terrified one of their most respected citizens. The Whitlock family themselves vanished from the historical record with startling abruptness. Property tax records showed regular payments through 1889, then nothing. The 1890 census listed the Whitlock farm as abandoned property. No forwarding address was recorded. No sale of livestock or equipment was documented. The family that had worked the land for 3 generations simply disappeared, leaving behind their barn, their fields, and their impossibly burning haystack. The photograph that Samuel Godfrey had taken on that crisp November morning in 1887 was initially dismissed as nothing more than a curiosity, an interesting example of accidental timing that had captured a routine farm fire at its most photogenic moment. But as Miss Harrow's research expanded, other investigators began to examine the image with growing fascination and mounting dread. What you're about to hear is drawn from coroner's notes, parish records, and the archived correspondence of 3 men who tried, and failed, to explain what they saw. The flames danced against the November twilight like serpents made of light, casting their golden glow across the weathered timber of the Whitlock barn. Josiah Creel pulled his woolen coat tighter around his shoulders as he stood at the edge of his property, watching the impossible fire that had been burning for 7 days without consuming a single stalk of straw. The Volunteer Fire Brigade had long since given up their efforts. Chief Martin Endicott had returned twice since that first night, each time more bewildered than the last. The water from their hand pumps passed through the flames as though the fire were nothing more than an illusion, yet the light it cast was real enough to illuminate the entire barnyard. "Still burning, I see," came a voice from behind Creel. He turned to find Reverend Thaddeus Boone approaching, his black coat billowing in the cold wind. The Methodist preacher had been traveling through Ashford for 3 days, staying at the inn while conducting evening services for whoever would listen. "Aye, Reverend," Creel replied, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. 7 days now, and not a blade of grass beneath it so much as singed. Boone stepped closer to the fence that separated Creel's land from the Whitlock property. The abandoned barn loomed in the gathering darkness, its gambrel roof cutting a stark silhouette against the star-filled sky. The haystack, positioned near the barn's eastern wall, continued its eternal dance of flame and shadow. "I've seen many things in my travels," Boone said quietly, his weathered hands gripping the wooden fence rail. "Revivals where men spoke in tongues, healings that defied medical explanation. But this—" He paused, studying the fire with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient scripture. "This challenges everything I thought I knew about the natural world." The two men stood in comfortable silence, both mesmerized by the phenomenon before them. The flames rose and fell in hypnotic patterns, sometimes reaching 4 feet in height, other times settling to mere inches above the straw. Yet through it all, the haystack remained intact, unchanged, as though the fire existed in some parallel realm that touched their world but could not affect it. "The photographer came by this morning," Creel mentioned, his voice barely above a whisper. "Fellow named Godfrey. Said he was here on official business for the Agriculture Commissioner." Boone's eyebrows rose slightly. "Did he capture the fire in his photograph?" "That's just it," Creel said, turning to face the preacher fully. "He claims he couldn't see the flames at all during daylight. Set up his equipment right there where we're standing. Took his picture when the sun was high. Said the haystack looked perfectly normal to him. The implications of this revelation hung between them like a weight. If the fire was only visible in darkness, what did that suggest about its nature? Was it truly fire at all, or something else entirely, something that existed beyond the boundaries of normal perception? As if summoned by their conversation, a figure emerged from the shadows near the barn. Both men tensed, recognizing the silhouette of Elihu Marsh, the county agriculture commissioner. Marsh walked with purpose toward the haystack, carrying what appeared to be a leather satchel and several instruments. "What's he doing out there at this hour?" Boone asked, his voice filled with concern. Creel shook his head slowly. "Can't say for certain, but I've heard talk in town. Some folks think the government knows more about this than they're letting on. Others say Marsh has been asking questions about similar incidents in neighboring counties." They watched as Marsh approached the burning haystack with scientific precision. He withdrew what looked like a thermometer from his satchel and held it close to the flames. Even from their distant vantage point, they could see his confusion as he examined the instrument. Next, he produced a small vial and appeared to be collecting samples of the air near the fire. "He feels no heat," Boone observed, noting how Marsh moved freely around the flames without any sign of discomfort. Just as the fire brigade reported. After nearly an hour of methodical observation and measurement, Marsh packed his instruments and walked back toward town, leaving the two observers with more questions than answers. The fire continued its eternal dance, indifferent to human scrutiny. Over the following days, word of the impossible fire spread through Ashford like ripples in a still pond. Neighbors who had initially dismissed the reports as exaggeration found themselves drawn to witness the phenomenon firsthand. Yet each visitor left more troubled than when they arrived, carrying with them the weight of something that challenged their understanding of reality itself. The local newspaper editor, Harold Whitman, arrived one evening with notebook in hand, ready to document what he assumed would be a simple case of mass hysteria. He left without writing a single word, his confident skepticism replaced by a haunted expression that his wife would later describe as the look of a man who had seen the impossible. Dr. Samuel Morrison, Ashford's only physician, made several visits to examine the site from a medical perspective. He theorized about optical illusions and collective hallucinations, but his scientific explanations crumbled when faced with the physical evidence of light without heat, flame without consumption. As November drew to a close, the phenomenon had attracted attention from beyond Ashford's borders. Scholars from the regional university sent letters requesting permission to study the site. A journalist from Boston arrived unannounced, only to depart the next morning with his story unwritten, muttering about editors who wouldn't believe the truth even if it burned before their eyes. Yet, for all the visitors and investigators, the fire remained constant, unchanged, and inexplicable. It had become a fixture of the landscape, as permanent and mysterious as the ancient stones that marked the county's earliest settlements. The townspeople had begun to speak of it differently now, not as a fire to be extinguished, but as a presence to be acknowledged and respected. Children were warned away from the site not out of fear of burns, but out of a deeper, more primal concern that some mysteries were too dangerous for young minds to contemplate. Creel found himself returning to his fence line each evening, drawn by something he couldn't name. The routine had become as natural as his morning chores, a pilgrimage to witness the impossible made manifest. On this particular night, nearly 3 weeks since the flames first appeared, he was joined once again by Reverend Boone, who had extended his stay in Ashford far beyond his original plans. "I've been thinking," the preacher said as they took their familiar positions along the fence, "about the nature of miracles, and whether we're witnessing something divine or something else entirely." Creel nodded thoughtfully. The question had haunted him as well. Was this phenomenon a blessing or a curse? A sign from heaven or a warning of something darker? "In my experience," Boone continued, "the truly miraculous often appears ordinary until you look closely. But this announces itself as extraordinary from the very beginning. It demands to be seen, to be questioned, to be feared." The flames seemed to pulse brighter at his words, as though responding to the theological discussion. Both men noticed the change but said nothing, each lost in his own contemplation of forces beyond human understanding. As December approached, the mystery had settled into the rhythm of daily life in Ashford, becoming part of the town's identity in ways both subtle and profound. The impossible fire had taught them that the world held secrets far stranger than they had ever imagined, secrets that burned eternal and consumed nothing, leaving only questions in their wake. Standing there in the cold November night, watching flames that defied every law of nature they had ever known, both men understood that they had become witnesses to something that would change how they saw the world forever. The fire would continue to burn, would continue to mystify, and would continue to whisper its unanswerable question into the darkness. By December, the town had begun to speak of it in whispers, never in print, never in formal complaint, but always with the same question: what burns forever and consumes nothing? On the morning of January 9th, 1888, Dr. Ansel Pruitt stepped down from his carriage onto the frozen ground of the Whitlock property, his breath forming small clouds in the bitter air. The winter had been particularly harsh that year, and the countryside lay buried beneath a thick blanket of snow that stretched endlessly across the Vermont landscape. Pruitt was a man of science, methodical in his approach and skeptical by nature, which made his presence at this remote farm all the more significant. Word of the impossible fire had reached him through channels he trusted, and despite his initial disbelief, the persistent accounts had finally compelled him to investigate personally. He carried with him the tools of his trade: a mercury thermometer calibrated just days before, a surveyor's chain for precise measurements, and a notebook bound in black oilcloth that had accompanied him on countless expeditions. The wind cut through his woolen coat as he approached the haystack, which stood like a beacon against the white expanse, flames dancing along its surface in defiance of every natural law he understood. The sight stopped him in his tracks, not because it was beautiful or terrifying, but because it simply should not exist. Pruitt's hands trembled slightly as he removed the thermometer from its protective case, though whether from cold or anticipation, he could not say. The ambient air temperature registered 19 degrees Fahrenheit, well below the freezing point that should have made any normal fire impossible to sustain. He recorded this measurement carefully in his notebook, his precise handwriting reflecting years of scientific training. Moving closer to the haystack, he positioned himself 3 yards away and waited for the mercury to settle. 18 degrees. The number stared back at him from the instrument's face like an accusation against everything he had been taught about the fundamental principles of combustion. At 1 yard from the burning haystack, with flames so close he could see individual stalks of hay writhing in what appeared to be thermal agony, the thermometer read 17 degrees. Pruitt stared at the impossible reading for a full minute, then checked his instrument again, wondering if the extreme cold had somehow affected its accuracy. But the mercury remained steadfast in its testimony. The fire before him, bright and active and undeniably real, was producing no measurable heat whatsoever. In his notebook, he wrote with careful deliberation, "The fire appears to be thermodynamically inert." The implications of this observation weighed heavily on Pruitt's mind as he returned to his study that evening. He was not a man given to flights of fancy or supernatural speculation, yet the evidence before him demanded an explanation that conventional science could not provide. After much deliberation, he decided to seek the counsel of an expert whose reputation for analytical precision matched his own. On January 11th, he returned to the Whitlock property with a pair of sharp scissors and carefully clipped a sample of straw from the very base of the haystack, where the flames appeared to be most active. The package he sent to Professor Gavin Rutledge at Brattleboro Technical Institute contained not only the straw sample but also a detailed sketch of the flame's peculiar shape and behavior, along with a letter requesting the most thorough chemical analysis possible. Rutledge was known throughout New England for his meticulous laboratory work and his unwillingness to accept results that did not align with established chemical principles. If anyone could provide a rational explanation for the phenomenon, it would be him. The weeks that followed passed slowly for Pruitt, filled with restless nights and constant questioning of his own observations. When Rutledge's reply finally arrived on February 2nd, the professor's words offered no comfort. The straw shows no char, no residue of accelerant, no structural breakdown whatsoever. It is, chemically, untouched. I cannot reconcile this with your field observations. The letter went on to detail the extensive tests Rutledge had performed, each one confirming that the sample had never been exposed to heat or flame of any kind. Yet Pruitt had cut it himself from the base of a burning haystack. Faced with this contradiction between visual evidence and scientific analysis, Pruitt realized he needed a third perspective, someone who could examine the phenomenon from an entirely different angle. In March, he contacted Mr. Cornelius Voss, an optical instrument specialist from the Burlington Scientific Society, whose expertise in light and optical phenomena was renowned throughout the region. Voss was a practical man who approached mysteries with expensive equipment and methodical precision, qualities that made him invaluable in situations where conventional wisdom proved inadequate. On March 14, 1888, Voss arrived at the Whitlock property carrying a spectroscope and a chronometer, instruments that represented the cutting edge of optical science. The day was clear and cold, perfect conditions for his observations. He spent 4 hours at the site, positioning his spectroscope at various angles and distances from the flame, recording measurements with the dedication of a man who understood that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence. The spectroscope revealed what appeared to be a continuous emission spectrum consistent with combustion, confirming that the light being produced matched every characteristic of a genuine fire. But it was the chronometer that provided the most disturbing revelation. Voss had placed the precision timepiece within 2 feet of the blaze, intending to measure the duration of his observations with scientific accuracy. When he compared its reading to a second chronometer kept in his carriage, he discovered that the instrument near the fire had run 6 minutes slow over the course of 1 measured hour. He repeated the experiment twice more, with identical results each time. Time itself, it seemed, was being affected by proximity to the phenomenon. In his subsequent letter to Pruitt, Voss wrote with the careful language of a man who knew his reputation depended on accuracy. "I have verified your account. The fire is real. The heat is absent. Time itself appears to resist proximity to the phenomenon. The implications of this statement hung in the air like smoke from an impossible flame. 3 men of science, using 3 different approaches, had confirmed that they were dealing with something that existed beyond the boundaries of natural law. The effects of their investigations began to ripple outward into the local community. On March 22nd, Deacon Lemuel Stokes made a brief but telling notation in the Ashford Parish Register. Congregants refuse to walk the western road after dark. The Whitlock property is shunned. The simple words carried the weight of a community's growing fear and superstition. What had begun as a curious anomaly was becoming a source of genuine terror for the local population. Meanwhile, in Boston, Godfrey's photograph had begun circulating quietly among photographic societies, passed from hand to hand like a secret that no one quite knew how to handle. Every expert who examined it reached the same conclusion. They could find no evidence of emulsion defect, double exposure, or deliberate hoax. The image appeared to be an accurate representation of something that should not exist, captured with perfect technical precision by a photographer whose skill was beyond question. By April 1888, the situation had reached a troubling impasse. 3 experts from 3 different disciplines had provided 3 separate confirmations of the phenomenon's reality, yet none could offer an explanation that did not require abandoning fundamental laws of nature. Pruitt sat in his study one evening, surrounded by correspondence and reports, contemplating the magnitude of what they had discovered. The fire continued to burn on the Whitlock property, indifferent to their investigations and theories, existing in defiance of everything they thought they knew about the physical world. The weight of scientific authority had been brought to bear on the mystery, and science itself had been found wanting. Each expert had approached the problem with confidence in their methods and instruments, only to find themselves confronting evidence that challenged the very foundations of their understanding. The fire burned without heat, consumed without destroying, and somehow influenced the passage of time itself. It was a phenomenon that existed at the intersection of the possible and the impossible, demanding explanations that human knowledge could not yet provide. As Pruitt closed his notebook that evening and prepared to retire, he reflected on the words he had written weeks earlier. The phrase echoed in his mind with growing significance, a summary not just of their findings but of their failure to comprehend what they had witnessed. The community's fear was understandable, perhaps even rational, when faced with something that operated outside the rules that governed their world. The question now was not whether the phenomenon was real, that had been established beyond doubt, but what its existence meant for everything they thought they knew about the nature of reality itself. 3 experts, 3 disciplines, 3 confirmations, and not one explanation that did not require abandoning a law of nature. Professor Rutledge adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles as he stared at the sample vials arranged on his laboratory bench, each containing soil scraped from beneath the impossible fire. The amber liquid within caught the gaslight, swirling with sediment that refused to settle. He had spent 3 sleepless nights analyzing the composition, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he recorded each measurement in his leather-bound journal. "Chemical luminescence," he muttered to himself, the words echoing in the empty laboratory. "It must be phosphorescent compounds from contaminated fertilizer." His voice carried the weight of a man desperate to impose logic upon the inexplicable. The theory felt solid in his mind, the visual consistency of the flames, the lack of fuel consumption, all pointing toward some scientific explanation that would restore order to his understanding of the world. Yet even as he wrote his conclusions, doubt gnawed at him like a persistent ache. Voss's spectroscope readings haunted his thoughts, showing a true combustion signature that defied his careful rationalization. The chronometric distortion remained unexplained, a crack in his theory wide enough to swallow his confidence whole. Rutledge set down his pen and rubbed his tired eyes, knowing his explanation was incomplete but unable to see beyond the boundaries of accepted science. Meanwhile, across town in the dimly lit rectory, Deacon Stokes knelt in fervent prayer before a wooden crucifix, his knuckles white as he gripped his rosary. The candlelight flickered across his gaunt features, casting deep shadows that seemed to dance with hidden knowledge. He had witnessed something in Ezra Whitlock's behavior during the summer of 1887, a sudden withdrawal from church life, furtive glances during sermons, and whispered conversations that ceased whenever Stokes approached. The discovery of the circle of stones and ash inside the barn had confirmed his darkest suspicions. With trembling hands, Stokes reached for his quill and began composing a letter to the Bishop of Vermont, each word carefully chosen to convey the gravity of what he believed had transpired. "Divine retribution," he wrote, sealing his theory in wax and shadow. "Eternal and punitive." The letter would remain unopened for decades, a testament to truths too terrible for immediate revelation. In his cluttered study filled with astronomical charts and measurement instruments, Pruitt hunched over his ledger by lamplight, his mathematical mind racing through calculations that defied conventional understanding. The chronometer's drift had sparked an impossible idea, one that made his hands shake as he considered its implications. What if the fire existed outside the normal flow of time itself? What if the fire is not burning now, but then, he scribbled in the margin, his handwriting growing increasingly erratic. What if we are looking backward, or at forward? The notion of a temporal fold, a loop or scar in time rendering a single moment perpetually visible, had no foundation in 19th-century physics. Yet it was the only explanation that accounted for every anomaly they had observed. Pruitt stared at his words, terrified by their implications and the vast unknowns they suggested. Outside the realm of formal investigation, a quieter theory spread among Ashford's farmers like smoke drifting across morning fields. They gathered in barns and around kitchen tables, their weathered faces grave as they shared their ancestral understanding of things that science could not touch. Old Henrik, whose family had worked the land for 3 generations, spoke in hushed tones about thresholds between worlds. "Some places ain't meant for crossing," he said, his voice carrying the weight of folk wisdom passed down through generations. "That fire's a warning, mark my words, a warning not to pass through." The other farmers nodded solemnly, their calloused hands wrapped around steaming cups of coffee, understanding in their bones what the learned men could not grasp with their instruments and theories. As winter deepened and spring approached, the weight of failure settled upon each investigator like frost on bare ground. No theory had been proven, no authority had issued a final report that could lay the mystery to rest. The county clerk, overwhelmed by questions he could not answer, classified the case as an unresolved atmospheric phenomenon, a designation that satisfied no one and only deepened the sense of unease that permeated the community. The burning haystack continued its impossible dance, indifferent to human theories and explanations, a constant reminder that some mysteries refused to yield their secrets to mortal understanding. By the spring of 1889, 3 men had tried to solve it, and each, in his own words, confessed failure. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of mystery, the supernatural, and the eerie persistence of the past in forgotten places. Its purpose is to raise awareness, provoke curiosity, and inspire reflection on the thin boundary between history and the unexplained.